It's the week beginning Monday, the 10th of September, and this is Business Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. All through this bonus series, we've been speaking with industry experts about a business story that'll shape how we live our lives in the years to come. I'm Ollie Mann. Let's unwrap the business week. And joining me today from the Wickes digital team is Jamie Timpson, and alongside him, our special guest, Dr. Rachel Aldred, Reader in Transport at the University of Westminster. Rachel, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The Evening Standard called you one of the most influential Londoners when it comes to transport. How did you earn that title?
Well, I'd like to think it's because I'm doing interesting work in areas that are policy relevant. I try and look at the barriers and how they can be overcome. So it could be a range of different barriers. Safety is an obvious one, but there's also policy, political barriers and so on. And learning from success, trying to figure out what works and how we can generalise it.
And what story have you brought with you today?
We've all seen people cycling like idiots, but is driving the real idiocy?
4 years ago, the government recognised that many of our road traffic laws aren't working, and they promised a full review of road traffic offences and penalties. Whilst we've been waiting for that review, over 1,800 pedestrians have died on Great Britain's roads, 99.4% of them in collisions with motor vehicles. But rather than having a full review, the government announced last week that they were going to focus purely on cycling offences. Here at Cycling UK, we've long supported the promised review of all traffic offences, and we've no objection to cycling offences being included in those. But to focus solely on them would just be tinkering at the edges.
That was Duncan Dollimore, Head of Campaigns for the pressure group Cycling UK, speaking in August this year. Rachel, why cycling? Surely the future is electric cars.
One of the things about electric cars is that they reproduce quite a few of the problems that non-electric cars do. They're very space inefficient, they don't get rid of congestion, they don't help people exercise. So they're not the answer.
OK, so what did this report say about cycling?
So this is some work by colleagues at University College London, and it's quite interesting because they were able to look at the risk posed to other road users by people driving and people cycling. So actually to say per hour driving or per hour cycling, what are the impacts? And perhaps not surprisingly, but we would much rather people cycle than drive in terms of other people being killed, being injured. There's some also interesting facts about how this varies by gender and age. So young men turn out to be the most dangerous drivers. So that's actually a particularly good reason for why we want young men cycling.
That's interesting, isn't it, Jamie? Because one of the things that people say when you say you want to cycle to work is, I wouldn't do that in London, mate. It's lethal. You know, I do it around Oxford, I do it around Brighton. I'm not going to get on the road in London.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where, because we've had for quite a long time this feeling that the road is designated for cars and that we've just got to work out a way to fit bikes around it. And, you know, partially I think introduction of segregated cycle lanes adds into this mentality of us versus them in terms of motorists and cyclists. And I'd much rather have a situation where everyone was educated to say that these roads are for all people. And while I totally believe that, you know, segregated cycle lanes are safer for the people who are on them, I actually think that there is an element of, you know, the introduction of cycle lanes probably does pit motorists and cyclists against each other.
That's interesting, and this is it's a very interesting debate, because actually some of the evidence that's coming out, particularly of North America, is that people driving would actually prefer to be separated from people cycling on main roads, because it's quite stressful to interact for drivers to deal with people cycling on those kind of roads. So I actually feel that protected cycle lanes are actually potentially good for drivers as well.
OK, Jamie, we're here on the business version of the show. What do you think the benefits to businesses are of encouraging their staff to cycle?
I think there's, you know, lots and lots of reports that show that a kind of exercise every day is hugely important to your mental health and your capacity to be able to work. So I think from a business perspective, if you want healthier, happier workforce, engaging in exercise every morning, particularly if it's safe and it's not putting you through an element of stress or anything like that, is going to be beneficial. I also think there's another example of how it can be positive for businesses is that it's very important from a PR perspective at the moment to be seen to be green and engaging in the environment. You know, if you want your company to be taken seriously or to be looked on favourably, saying that you have actually proper cycle to work schemes where you pay for the bike and then you get it given back to them, or even, things like cycling proficiency lessons, subsidizing cycling proficiency lessons for people and giving people the chance to learn how to cycle in the city. That'll be great PR for a business that's wanting to, to set itself apart from the rest of the herd.
Although, Rachel, you're nodding with that, but actually, what is the experience of businesses that try and support their employees in cycling? Because and I'm sure other people have, walked past many businesses in the City of London that have plenty of bicycle racks outside. They have showers downstairs so that people can, get clean when they come in, and people aren't using them.
When you look at racks parked outside, those won't be the racks for the employees. Generally, companies that are serious about cycling have racks. My own university does. We have racks in what's amusingly called the car park, but hardly anyone drives. So basically, it's the cycle park, and that's where people park, and you'll find those full. But if you just walk past the street, you would see a few racks outside that are not full. So I think, and those racks are being used. And increasingly, interestingly, we're seeing property developers, we're seeing companies saying they want proper cycling facilities, they want the space for parking and for showers and so on. And actually that's increasingly more important to them in places like inner and central London than car parking, because people are not driving so much anymore.
I think it's also got to come, though, from the government. Like, the government have got to work with businesses and then allow businesses and promote cycling as an option. There's a great article in City Metric by Laura Laker recently about the HS2 development and about UK Cycling going to them and asking them or holding the government to account about providing infrastructure, proper cycling infrastructure along the HS2 line. This is outside of London, but in the north, and it's eye-opening. I literally think everyone should read it, because it actually shows how politicians view cycling outside of what they say on, and the way that they just kind of dismissed it as not something that was a viable alternative. They talked about what whether or not communities, rural communities, would be interested in cycling to work, and the kind of obvious answer is, well, if you're not going to provide it to them, if you're going to make them cycle along a dual carriageway behind a big lorry, of course they're not going to be interested in cycling to work.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think it's really interesting that we've seen more businesses get behind cycling and say, we want better facilities, we want better support for cycling. And for instance, around here, there's the Tavistock-Torrington cycle route, which was improved. And a lot of businesses, a lot of local organisations did write in and say, we want this route, our employees are benefiting, our students are benefiting.
So outside of London then, what are the realistic chances that things like cycle highways get implemented? Because I live not far from London. I live in Hertfordshire. I'd love to be able to cycle to the station if I could. I wouldn't, because it is lethal. I live on a little country road.
I think that's why the point about the government is important too, because I think there needs to be more of a lead from government. At the moment, you can see things in London, for instance, in Greater Manchester, some of these larger metropolitan areas which have more resources, more personnel, are more able to do stuff. But some of those smaller market towns, for instance, distances are often short. More walking and cycling is possible, and you can do things in rural areas. There's a lot of Dutch and Danish rural areas where those roads are not so lethal. They are quieter, they are safer for walking and cycling.
Also, just to give a figure, return on investment for cycling infrastructure ranges between £5.50 and £35 per £1 spent. To put that in context, HS2 only has a return of investment of £1.47, and that's mainly to do with cutting business times of travel rather than anything to do with safety or efficiency or helping communities along the route.
Do you cycle, Rachel?
I do indeed.
Are there times where you think, I can't because it's too dangerous or because the provision isn't there?
Yes, not so much. My commute in London, I know, I've got a decent route mostly for my commute into London, but there is certainly, and I think of, for instance, some rural A roads, and I've seen the stats for risk on rural A roads that I would not cycle. They are just terrifying. So there are places I wouldn't cycle, and I'm fairly hardened. I've been cycling in London for some time.
I have a couple of anecdotal things from friends that have said that the cycle superhighways, while obviously a very good thing, have actually been overtaken by some quite aggressive cyclists. These people I have been told at least that there are quite a lot of, not to generalise, but middle-aged men in Lycra who are treating it like the Tour de France and trying to go as fast as possible. And actually that does put some people off from using the cycle superhighways. And that's not to say that they're not a good thing. It just means that actually there are some aggressive cyclists and that are putting people off from cycling.
Is casual cycling, another way to encourage people? You've got bike hire schemes and stuff like that, because the kind of character Jamie's talking about are the ones who I perceive as a driver and occasional pedestrian, are the people who take it very, very seriously. They've got the costume, they've got their route. The idea that I just might want to go from one place to another casually and a bike be an option, seems like that's an area that's worth investing in.
But infrastructure needs to be part of that, but not just infrastructure to commute destinations like the superhighways, which are important, but also local infrastructure as well. And I think the example of, for instance, the Mini Hollands are quite interesting because Waltham Forest, the earliest Mini Holland. So the Mini Hollands schemes are 3 boroughs in outer London which have significant amounts of funding to improve things for walking and cycling, to put infrastructure in place. So this is ongoing, and it's big amounts of money. It's £100 million between them. So some quite significant interventions. And in Waltham Forest, what they've started off doing is within local neighbourhoods, closing off roads to through motor traffic and making them nicer for walking and cycling. So you get neighbourhoods that are quiet, friendly and slow speed. And that we found, so I've been doing some work looking at the impacts of this, and that seems to have increased levels of walking and cycling because you've got nice local routes that people can use to get about. So it is infrastructure, but it's potentially like local infrastructure as well.
And it's called Mini Holland presumably after the Netherlands because that's where cycling is very popular.
Yes.
What's the evidence from there that people are actually leading happier, healthier lives as a result of cycling?
I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence from public health, and the Netherlands, for instance, has very relatively low child obesity rates. But there's quite a lot of evidence from public health that if we did succeed in getting more people walking and cycling, then the public health benefits would be really substantial. And yeah,
it's also about tolerance. I think, like having gone to places like Amsterdam and Berlin and Holland and Germany, there is an increasing level of tolerance of both drivers and non-drivers on the routes, and that also makes it a much more happier and harmonious place to be. I think if if everyone is tolerating each other and moving things forward, that actually improves people's mental health.
And Rachel, where do you expect us to be in, say, a decade's time?
I would hope that we're in that better place where we achieve those government goals of making walking and cycling that everyday choice for short journeys. But I worry, and I also worry about the kind of narrative of everybody should tolerate each other, because if we look at who are the victims on the roads, it's people walking and cycling disproportionately. And there's evidence that, for instance, drivers don't see people cycling as equal road users, whereas cyclists, in a sense, have to respect drivers because they could be injured at any moment. So I think we do actually need to shift our view to give more priority to people walking and cycling, who at the moment are seen as, not really priority road users, who are often pushed to the side and made to wait. So I do think we need a change in attitude to deprioritise driving as well.
Do you think realistically, though, we in Britain are going to be ahead of the curve on this? Because it sounds like what you're saying is historically we haven't been.
Well, actually, in the 1950s, cycling was an everyday thing. Cycling was like 25% mode share, 25% of trips, basically. So we did used to have lots of people cycling in this country. We used to have an awful lot more walking as well. Things can change really fast, I think, as well. If you look back, when I started cycling in London, it was seen as something particularly crazy to do. If you cycle in London, you must be really, really nuts. But actually, the growth in cycling that we've seen in London now means that people in other parts of the country are looking to London and say, oh, London's doing something right. Obviously it's not perfect, but it's starting to do something right. So you can see quite a quick turnaround. And I think we could see change happen fast.
And under your kind of transport research brief, how much of the move into cycling do you think isn't because of health, but is because people can't afford to get on the train?
Personally, I don't think health is necessarily a big individual motivator. I think health is a good motivator for governments in terms of a healthier population.
But what I'm saying is, if the reason is they can't afford public transport, that's not something to celebrate, is it?
Large parts of the country, people don't really have a great choice of public transport, which isn't something to celebrate either. It's not even affording it, it's that the service isn't there. And I think one thing in London that's helped cycling actually is the fact that the public transport system is there and it allows people to be multimodal so that people have the choice of different modes. I think if if people are more attached to the car, it makes it harder for them to shift. But yeah, we want cycling and walking to be attractive, not just what you do because you don't have anything else.
There you go, Jamie. Your mission for today is to use the phrase multimodal in a conversation outside of this podcast. Thank you, Rachel Aldred, and to Jamie Timpson. That is it. That is your business briefing for this week. For more from our series on good news for British business, sponsored by Barclays Corporate Banking, go to theweek.co.uk/good news or see this week's magazine. And to subscribe to hear our main podcast, The Week Unwrapped, then just head to theweekunwrapped.com. I've been Ollie Mann. The music is by Tom Morby, our producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until next time, bye-bye.